We're following breaking news on the tensions between Canada and the United States. U.S. President Donald Trump has abruptly reversed course on a new trade relationship between Canada and China. Trump had previously supported the recently signed deal, but now he's making fresh tariff threats over that very agreement. Linda is back with...
American farmers are facing a crisis most people do not know about, and the United States gets 87% of a critical farming ingredient from Canada. And without it, crops cannot grow. And now tariffs have made this ingredient much more expensive, and farmers are paying the price. And soon American families will too at the grocery store. The Fertilizer Institute states that 85% of U.S. potash imports come from Canada, and potash is an irreplaceable component of modern agricultural production. And the U.S. has historically sourced nearly all the potash used by farmers from international markets. Because potash deposits are geographically specific, and mine development in the U.S. is time-intensive and costly. Canada supplies the United States with nearly 10% of its nitrogen fertilizer, needs accounting for 25% of total nitrogen fertilizer imports, and nearly 20% of sulfur consumed by U.S. agriculture. Canada has the world's largest potash reserves, with 1.1 billion tons of potash in potassium oxide equivalent, according to Natural Resources Canada. And this is approximately 5 times larger than U.S. reserves. Canada's scale of potash mining by production volumes is 36 times larger than the US. And in 2023, Canada accounted for more than 32% of global potash production and over 41% of global exports. The United States gets a small amount of potash from domestic mines in Utah, New Mexico, and Michigan, and industry experts note these facilities have struggled with lower quality potash rock. Canada supplies nearly 90% of the potash imported into the US, and there are few viable alternative sources. And America's other major exporters of potash are Belarus and Russia, which are not considered reliable suppliers given geopolitical circumstances. Nutrien is the world's largest single producer and exporter of potash, and the company sold more than 14.4 million metric tons of potash in 2024 and delivers to more than 40 countries around the world. Nutrien owns 6 of Canada's active potash mines, and the company's 6 operating potash facilities are located in Saskatchewan. And Canada's 11 active mines are in Saskatchewan and produce an estimated 21.9 million tons of potash in 2023. The President of the United States, Donald Trump, imposed tariffs on Canadian fertilizer imports in February 2025, and the tariffs started at 25% before being reduced to 10% after pushback from American farmers and industry groups. The impact on fertilizer costs has been significant, and the U.S. import price index for chemical fertilizers rose from 164.5 in December 2024 to 186.5 in September 2025. The U.S. prices paid index tracking costs paid by U.S. farmers rose to 149.9 in June 2025, up from 139.9 the year before. Fertilizer costs have been the primary driver for rising costs for U.S. crop farmers, up 11% in the index over that period. Fertilizer accounts for 45% of operating expenses for U.S. corn farmers. According to analysis and industry sources indicate, fertilizer represents between 30% and 45% of farmer annual operating costs. Applying just the right amount at the right price and at the right time can be the difference between turning a profit and losing money for farmers. Potash prices are currently around $450 per ton, according to Illinois production cost report figures from early 2025. Full pass-through of a 25% tariff could increase prices by more than $100 per ton for supplies sourced from Canada. Josh Linville, Vice President of Fertilizer with StoneX, states that unlike some other tariffs where the seller bears the brunt of the cost, potash exports are different, and Canada holds the cards in this supply relationship, and domestic U.S. production cannot fill the gap. Bob Thompson, president of the Michigan Farmers Union, says any added costs brought by tariffs are passed down to individual farmers, and farmers have no way of recouping that cost, typically because crops are sold at the whim of whatever the market is rather than allowing farmers to set their own price. Bill Knudsen, a professor at the Michigan State Department of Agricultural, Food, and Resource Economics, says tariffs inevitably push the price of potash up and farm profits down. Just about any crop uses potash in some ways, so that is going to reduce profitability. Knudsen states, and U.S. agriculture is already looking at a decline in farm income, especially for field crop producers. Facing the third year of a downturn in corn prices, corn farmers are strapped for cash, and the COVID-19 pandemic, the war in Ukraine, and high natural gas prices pushed up fertilizer costs to historic highs in recent years. Canadian reserves of potash are nearly 5 times larger than those in the US, according to the US Geological Survey. It may be possible for the US to expand its production of nitrogen fertilizer, but that may not benefit farmers because any rise in US fertilizer output that is propelled by tariffs would mean producers in that country are being protected from cheaper foreign imports, says Joe Jansen, an agricultural economist at the University of Illinois. And for farmers, all of that would raise costs. A proposed potash mine in Osceola County, Michigan could eventually produce 800,000 tons of potash per year, but it depends on a $1.1 billion federal loan that received conditional approval in January 2025. Even if approved, new US mines would take many years to meet domestic demand. In December 2025, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, said he is considering severe tariffs on Canadian fertilizer imports to boost US production, and the United States Department of Agriculture says it has a plan to reshore fertilizer manufacturing, but industry groups warn supply risks remain. The Fertilizer Institute is urging exemptions for Canadian potash, calling it critical to US agriculture. Companies like Nutrien warn that any new tariffs would raise costs for American farmers. And while US farmers rely heavily on Canadian potash, Canadian producers are expanding globally, including BHP's Jansen project, which begins production in 2026. With over 90% of US potash imported mostly from Canada, tariffs would effectively raise costs for farmers already facing tight margins.